Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hidden Stories of the Royal Parks, where we lift the lid on some of the fascinating stories of the Royal Parks in London and learn what makes them so special from the people who work there. I'm Lucy Kellet and I'm the Interpretation Manager at the Royal Parks. For a century, this time of year has been indelibly associated with remembrance of the war dead, the 11th of November marking the end of the First World War. And believe it or not, the Royal Parks had a role to play in protecting Britain during both World Wars. To learn more about this, I spoke to David Ivison, historical researcher at the Royal Parks Guild. Made up of many former members of staff, the Guild champions the work and heritage of the Royal Parks. Dave has also published a book, The Royal Parks in the Great War, which is available on our website. In this episode, Dave talks to me about the variety of uses the parks had in both conflicts, the impact on their landscapes, and the park staff who made the ultimate sacrifice for their country. Thank you so much, Dave, for joining us today. It's great to have you with us, particularly to talk about a subject that I guess is a bit of a mystery to a lot of people, because I think they'd be surprised to think of the parks as playing a practical role on the home front during wartime, especially when you think of parks as being places of recreation and escapism and leisure. What kinds of function did they serve in the First World War, and how did that come about?
Well, it was mainly the militarisation, if you call it that way. The government were looking around, obviously, and the military, of where they could really put a lot of their buildings that had to house a lot more civil servants, a lot more of the troops coming in. There was recruitment and so on. There was requisitioning of lots of cars, lorries, petrol, horses, and these had to be put somewhere. And so the Serpentine Road in Hyde Park, for instance, was lined full of lorries and cars. Also, at the first few months of the war, there was lots of recruitment rallies, of course. The army was looking for new recruits, men were important. And so you had the parade ground in Hyde Park, which is adjacent to Park Lane. That was full of recruitment activity. So all these sort of things, almost immediately, was men, materials and so on. But it wasn't until probably another few months when things really started to get going and they realised that the war was going to extend, that they started building in the parks. And this is where you get this real change in the, if you like, the outlook of the park, what's in the park, and starting to affect the people using the parks, because they suddenly realised that a lot of the ground they walked along, the flower beds they looked at, obviously were being underused, and buildings were starting to be erected. St James's Park was probably the worst affected. There were 8 large buildings erected in St James's Park between 1915 and 1917, the largest of which filled what was the lake in St James's Park. This is the lake part that's on the end, Buckingham Palace end, going all the way down to what is now where the Pelicans are. That was a huge 3-storey concrete block office, and that was the Ministry of Shipping, huge place. From there, most of the world's shipping was controlled, apparently. But there were other buildings as well. There was a passport office, the Trade Intelligence Department, there's another one. And so all of the, if you like, civil servants that had to be doing all the paperwork and so on were put into St James's. Probably the next affected one would be Regent's Park, the Regent's Park. They had several large construction projects. One was called the Home Depot. Now, this was the post office's main sorting office for all of the mail that was going out to the troops in the Western Front and around the Mediterranean theatre. And in its peak, this Home Depot, because all the letters were coming and going, reached 12 million items per week at its height. And the building, it was a wooden building put up in 10 weeks, and it covered 4 acres in extent. And then on Marylebone Green was a large aircraft spares factory or depot. That covered a huge area. I think it was about 15 acres, 20 acres, the whole of Marylebone Green. Richmond Park was another one with wide open spaces. That was used for experimental purposes. There was a 150-acre, what they called the bombing ground, and this was used for all their experiments. And there was one particular experiment which was not an invention, but an idea dreamt up by H.G. Wells, the author. And he put an idea to Churchill, Winston Churchill, who was the Minister of Munitions at the time, in 1917, and said that they could do with an aerial ropeway, which was taking materials from the storage areas in France through to the front line, because it was so shell craters and so on that they couldn't put the lorries or horses across it. So they suggested a collapsible aerial ropeway. And this was trialled at Richmond Park. Churchill, I believe, came down and had a look at it, and it was fairly successful, although the army didn't really appreciate it. There's big balloon squadrons in Richmond Park, and they did balloon experiments. And so this was where anything to do with the winches, the type of balloons, the cables, tensioning and so on, and also the early forms of parachute jumping. This was a great thing. There's lots of international people. The Japanese, Canadians, Americans all came to Richmond Park to see these balloon jumps and all the experiments that had been done there.
So fascinating there to hear about the colossal scale and the innovation, obviously, that was happening during that time, all the various ways that we contributed militarily. What about civilian life and the role that civilians could play on the home front?
The Royal Parks tried to keep people coming into the parks. They didn't close anything too much. They always tried to keep things open as much as possible, because they didn't like giving over this land to the army. They were really against it in some ways, but obviously the needs must. And towards the end of 1916, the food shortages were getting rather acute. U-boats were sinking some of the ships coming over from America and whatever with food. So the government had to look at doing grow your own, basically. And this is where the allotment movement, if you like, started to gain traction. And the Prime Minister said in late 1916 that everybody should start growing their own. And this meant, of course, that these wide open spaces of the Royal Parks had to play their part. The chief of the Crop Research Station, the government organisation, he was called down to Richmond Park and Bushy Park, late 1916, and he recommended that wheat, barley, oats could be sown in those two areas. And you ended up with lots of acreage, nearly 160 acres, being ploughed up. There was also lots of allotments, and these were in most of the parks in one way or another. Greenwich Park, Primrose Hill, Richmond Park, Bushy Park, Kensington Gardens. Because they weren't producing any flowers, a lot of the flower beds and the glass houses and the nurseries were given over to allotments. And so you had all sorts of foodstuffs, tomatoes and so on, being done in the nurseries, and these were then sold. They weren't given away, they were sold to the local population. The Royal Parks had 2 demonstration plots, quite large areas that were marked out on the ground, and they were prepared and sown with a wide variety of vegetables and so on. One of these was in Kensington Gardens by the Albert Memorial, and another one is in the Regent's Park by the zoo. Now these were for the members of the public to come along and see what they could grow in their own premises, their own gardens and so on. And associated with that, the Royal Parks produced a booklet explaining what the best varieties were and how they would prepare the ground, seed them and so on and maintain them. So it is quite, I suppose in a way, an innovative thing that the Royal Parks did, getting the public involved in that way.
So, thinking about the Royal Park staff themselves and their contribution to the war effort at home or abroad, do we have any information about that?
Yes, there's 24 men of the Royal Parks who didn't come back from the war. Some of them were park keepers, some were gardeners, labourers, propagators. Those who were park keepers, these were ex-servicemen, generally who had had 23 years of good conduct in the army. So when the First World War started, a lot of park keepers with their military backgrounds were soon enlisted again to act as non-commissioned officers or training for other troops. So there was quite a large number of the park keepers who went, and there are several who didn't come back. One of them is Arthur William Berry. He was a gardener at Hampton Court. He was in the Royal Artillery, and he was killed in an air raid in September 1918. The second one is Ernest Frank Goodall. Again, he was from Hampton Court. He was a gardener, and he was killed in 1918 also, defending a redoubt near Kermoy in Belgium. And the third person was Horry Tribe. He was the propagator in Greenwich Park, and he sent a lot of letters back to his wife on his experiences in Serbia and then going into Egypt and through to Palestine. And he unfortunately was killed in the assault of Jerusalem in 1917. And his great-granddaughter reads his letters. These are on the Royal Parks website for you to contemplate and really get the feel of what it was like to be in the horrors of war.
Oh, what a poignant tribute, and how wonderful that you're able to uncover that during your research. It really helps, doesn't it, to sort of bring these people back to life in a sense. And actually thinking about coming back to life, how did the parks recover after the First World War? Were they able to get back to normal quickly, or were the landscapes irrevocably changed?
They weren't changed a great deal in the long term. However, it did take a while for the land to be recovered. The Royal Parks were very keen immediately after the cessation of hostilities that they should get their land back. It was part of the agreement with the government that any land that they took, as soon as the hostilities ceased, they would get their land back. However, this did not work out as they planned. I mentioned the home depot. In actual fact, it was 6 acres in all. They had started off with 4 acres of wooden buildings. It ended up at the end of the war with 6 acres of wooden buildings. In actual fact, that was not given up and removed until the early parts of the 1920s. What was then the newly formed Ministry of Pensions took over the home depot. So that took quite a while for them to vacate the home depot because they couldn't move until their offices in Acton were finished. I mentioned St James's Park had 7 major office blocks on their grounds. These were not removed until 1922. Then there's Bushy Park, where there was anti-aircraft guns. They were not removed until the early part of the 1920s. But I think the most aggravating to the Royal Parks was the allotments. This gained a lot of traction with the local people who got used to growing their own food and had been there for 3 years, 2 or 3 years. And the Royal Parks immediately, when the war ended, said we would like our grounds back now. They formed all sorts of societies and asked the local MPs that they had the rights to stay there and produce their own food. But again, there were lots of political pressures one way and then another. And it was not until the early parts again of the 1920s before the Royal Parks were able to persuade the ministers that the parks are for the quiet enjoyment of the public and not for the cultivation of crops. It wasn't until the early 1920s, I would say, until things really started getting back to how it was pre-war. Even with the flowers and the flower beds, this took a year or so. All of the beds were not cultivated. They were all given over to crops of vegetables and so on. Even the geranium beds outside the front of Buckingham Palace, they were given over to potatoes. But all that was, at the end of the war, the royal parks were very, very keen that it should give the land back to the public for their quiet, what they called their quiet enjoyment. The royal parks at that time were under the control of the Office of Works, which was a government department. But it was the king as the person ultimately in charge of the royal parks. Nothing could be done without having the king's permission. So any cultivation, any buildings going up, any hospital going in, all had to go through the king for his permission, because he was the one ultimately to give the okay for doing any building or any change of use of the park. And it was his insistence that at the end of the war, everything should go back to the public.
So, shifting focus to the Second World War, one of the things that sticks in people's minds about that conflict is the devastation caused to London and ordinary Londoners, thinking of the Blitz in particular, and the sort of unprecedented nature of warfare, I guess, and civilian involvement in warfare. And the royal parks weren't immune from that damage, were they? I'm sure I've seen some old news footage of Hyde Park in the wake of a bombing raid, and it wasn't the only part to be affected, I think.
Yes, the royal parks did suffer some damage during the war. Not a huge amount in terms of when you think of the West End or the docks in London, but there were several places that were damaged and destroyed. I do have a report of a mine that damaged Rangers Lodge, Hyde Park, on the 10th of September 1940. The report read, "This building received damage from an incendiary bomb which fell on the roof on the 19th September 1940. An high explosive bomb which fell on the drive on the 20th September 1940, and the blast from the high explosive bomb which wrecked the smithy." The smithy was a small building, I believe, that's now was in the storeyard in Hyde Park next to the old police house. The other known building we know that was completely destroyed was in the Regent's Park. This links back from World War I, and it was called St. Catherine's Hospital. And this was an American hospital at that time. St. Catherine's Hospital is located to the north of Cumberland Green and was a chateau-style house owned by an American financier. But in the Second World War, a landmine, as they called it, which would drop by parachute and were very explosive, landed 50 yards away from the building, exploded, and virtually destroyed the whole building. So that is why when you go to Cumberland Green now, looking northwards, you'll see just a few shrubs and trees where St. Catherine's Hospital used to be. I don't know of any other buildings that were, hit or destroyed in any great degree. One thing which is not noticeable that was affected by the bombing campaign the Germans led, and that was the amount of shrapnel that was falling through London at the time. And the parks were not immune to this. In the 1970s, when I was on the tree gang, there were many occasions when we were cutting trees in St. James's Park, Hyde Park, Kensington Gardens, when we were using our chainsaws, and then all of a sudden sparks would fly from the tree. And when we dug into the tree, we were finding shrapnel, small slithers, maybe 2 or 3 inches in length by about an inch, which was obviously flown through the air and embedded themselves into the trees, and the trees had just grown up around it. And so it was very interesting to see that historical note coming out of the parks even 30 years later. But no doubt the larger trees in there, the London planes and so on, will no doubt have many, many pounds weight of shrapnel in their stems to this very day.
A powerful testament to the survival abilities of nature.
Yes.
So, generally speaking, were the parks used in similar ways to the First World War, or were there any new developments?
In some ways, they were similar to the First World War. I think the experience they gained 20 years earlier was something that they must have thought on. Primarily, the main ones were for the production of crops. They started the Second World War with 80 acres in 1940, and it ended up in 1942 with 320 acres for crops. And also what was being used in the parks was the nurseries and the greenhouses. All of those were being utilised as well for producing tomatoes, things like tomatoes, lettuces, all of the crops that needed warmth or glasshouse. And 1942, there were 30 tonnes of tomatoes. The other thing, militarily, they had the great open spaces of Richmond Park, and they utilised this for lots of experimental work. There was, as we know, in the Richmond Park, the Phantom Squadron, which was used for intelligence purposes. Their soldiers were very highly trained to go behind enemy lines in France and so on to gain information. They did all of their training and were based at Richmond Park, and they utilised all those open spaces. Certainly there was more air raid precautions taken. There was lots of air raid shelters put into Green Park, where it abuts Piccadilly, and certainly in St James's Park. And also for protection of London, the anti-aircraft defences. The Royal Parks provided the space and the range, if you like, to protect London.
Must have been quite a fearsome sight.
It was, yeah. Well, I do know of, there's a chap round here in Teddington. He remembers coming in as a lad, walking in past the anti-aircraft guns. And I was talking to another chap who lived in Ham at the time, and he was a lad, and he used to go into the park and collect shrapnel from the anti-aircraft guns and so on when they were firing off, obviously. And this was the point of the First World War. When they were firing off all these anti-aircraft guns, they were pretty ineffective in the First World War, but apparently they were causing more damage to London from the shrapnel that was falling down from the shells that were being thrown up into the air than what the German bombers were doing. So you can just imagine, can't you? There were people during the First World War from London, because of the bombing raids and so on, and all this, metal coming down from the air, from shrapnel and so on, that people from London used to walk out from London and go and sleep in Richmond Park just to get away from all of the devastation.
Wow. And of course, Bushy Park, a bit of an unsung hero of the Royal Parks in West London, has a very special place to play in the history of the Second World War, doesn't it? It was the site of a major camp for US soldiers, if I'm right. But it also had a more secretive and pivotal purpose, perhaps.
Yes. In 1942, the Ministry of Works were asked to construct 4 rectangular buildings called Blocks A, B, C and D. They were asked by the Americans to put these up. They were bringing their troops in, and this was going to be used for the 8th United States Army Air Force. So they took over that as their headquarters for their European operations. The base was later named Camp Griffiths. This was after Lieutenant Colonel Townsend Griffiths. He was an 8th USAF pilot, and he was the first USAF officer to be killed in the European theatre of operations. Later in the war, the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, and this was in anticipation for the invasion of Europe, which they hoped to plan for 1944. First of all, his headquarters were put into London, but with all of the bombing and so on, it was decided to remove his headquarters from London to what was the American 8th Air Force headquarters. So he came down and he took over the headquarters with his own staff. And this was then called Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAEF, as they say. At this time, there were 1,600 United States and 1,200 British military personnel working in the camp. And these are all based in wooden huts in the northern side of the park and also down what is called Chestnut Avenue. For the next 12 weeks, 1944, SHAEF staff finalised the plans for D-Day to land 156,000 troops onto the beaches of Normandy. Camp itself was spread over quite a large area. I mentioned large blocks in the north of the park. There was the accommodation blocks, which were hidden in between the woods that are in Bushy Park. They also had an airfield in the south of the park, next to the paddocks, what's called the paddocks, was a light aircraft runway. And so all of the people coming from the different theatres of war or different parts of the UK used to come in and out of Bushy Park by these light planes which were based in the park.
Such an extraordinary amount of activity that's happening there at the park. You've got the secret planning of D-Day, runways and bombing raids, thousands of US troops. And yet, am I right in thinking that the locals didn't know what was going on there until after the war? I think I'd read that somewhere.
Yes, it was a very important communications centre. And so obviously there were very secret things that were going on inside one of the administration blocks. But the general park areas were still open. I have spoken with one or two local people who were children at the time, and they say that they used to come into the parks, play in the parks. They would meet the American soldiers, they would give them chocolate, and they'd play about with them. They'd even go into the camp. So I think that later is more like a playground, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about that, the sort of hidden history gradually emerging over time, if you like, and what we might still find in the parks today that are traces of that wartime past. What could people look out for? Is there anything to be seen?
I think the only visible ones that I'm aware of are, one, there is some balloon tethering points in Hyde Park, which I believe is near the old police house, and the other may be in Bushy Park, where there's some telephone wire insulation points that they'd obviously hammered into the trees when they were putting up their telephone communications between the different parts of the camp. Generally, the agreements with the military authorities when they took over any of these places was that they would remove all aspects, the foundations, the pipework, everything was to be removed at the end of hostilities. And this is what they did. It's amazing to think that the construction that was going on in the parks, you cannot see any hard sort of physical evidence to it.
Yeah, so it seems to be a bit of a treasure hunt, doesn't it? That you get out your binoculars, but instead of searching for birds, you should be looking for telegraph wires and barrage balloon posts and the like. Thinking about the shift then from the parks participating in the war and that kind of active role that they had to play through to remembering the war and how action is kind of memorialized and physicalized, I guess, in our parks today. There are a number of memorials in the parks, aren't there? And are there any in particular that you think people should seek out?
Yes, there are. My favourite, I think, and probably a favourite of many people, is the Guards Memorial opposite Horse Guards Parade in St James's Park. This is a memorial to the 5 Foot Guards regiments that took part in the war and was unveiled in 1926. The statues of the soldiers that adorn the memorial are cast from the melted guns. So that is a really poignant and a very impressive memorial. The second one, in my view, are the memorial gates on Constitution Hill, which is adjacent to Green Park. These are a memorial to the 5 million troops from the Indian subcontinent who served and lost their lives in the First World War. The third memorial is one for the men of the Royal Parks who died in the First World War. The Royal Parks had no memorial for these men, and it was a wonder to us why nothing had been done in the past from that era when it was such an organisation as the Royal Parks. So we investigated this 5 years ago to try and find out if there was a memorial in the parks, which we hadn't noticed, or there was none at all. After 2 years of research, we found the memorial to the men of the Office of Works, of which the Royal Parks was a part. And their memorial is in now what is the Treasury, adjacent to St James's Park. And this is a grand memorial to the 102 people of the Office of Works who died. And these included the 24 men of the Royal Parks. The Royal Parks Guild and the Royal Parks felt that there should be a memorial within the Royal Parks, especially on the 100th anniversary of the ending of the war, World War I. And so we, along with other partners, we went to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, went to Historic Royal Palaces, and we went to Heritage England. And so we all joined together and made or created this granite plaque. We then made arrangements to have this erected at its final resting place at Brompton Cemetery in Chelsea, which is a cemetery that is managed by the Royal Parks. And so if you go there today, just north of the chapel in the colonnade to the east, the first colonnade, you'll see the plaque resting on the wall of the colonnade with the 24 men rightfully put in the best position. I really do hope that people will go down there and have a look and reflect on the men who died and the horrors of war.
Yeah, that's such a poignant note to end on there, to remind us the extent to which those world wars really infiltrated every aspect of our lives and our environments, that even something as sort of beautiful and escapist and seemingly innocuous as the Royal Parks and working there, you still couldn't evade, as you say, the destruction and devastation of those wars. Thank you so much for your time today, Dave. It's been a wonderful insight into a hidden history, certainly of the parks and of our role in the wars and just how close to home the conflicts were. Thank you for joining us today to hear another hidden story of the Royal Parks. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you want to learn more about the parks during the First World War, do check out the dedicated section on our website for a wealth of information and evocative personal accounts. The Royal Parks is a charity that cares for the 8 Royal Parks of London. If you would like to support us, please go to royalparks.org.uk/support. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to bringing you another hidden story soon. In the meantime, take care and take a walk in a park. Our podcast series is a team effort from Laura McMahon, Kristen Mueller, Leddy Layson, and Lucy Kellet. This episode was edited by Hannah Hevman and Julia Letts for Better Lemon Creative Audio.